his father came to join him and to live with his son here in this area, and died here, so they buried him in the family plot. But his name was Moody Chase. Moody, an old kind of name that was fairly common in Puritan times, for example. It shows the background of the family, the cultural background there in New England. And also, Moody Chase was born in 1769. So he's one of the earlier burials. That is, he wasn't buried then, but one of the oldest people to be buried in this cemetery. Again, there's 28 people all told who were born before 1800 here. But I'm going to show you very shortly the oldest person, that is the firstborn person who was buried in the cemetery.
Okay, great, John. Thanks. John, as you're taking me through the old Macomb Cemetery, I can't help but notice that there are some stones that are, very well placed, very easy to read, but then there are some scattered about, propped up against trees, maybe not as readable. What is the story behind these? Why are these all sitting here?
Well, it's basically a question of a certain kind of cemetery deterioration. The old Macomb Cemetery is a good example of one that hasn't been looked after in terms of the condition of the stones or the placement of the stones over the years. And as a result, when stones fall over, which is very common with the early thin slate stones that if you get a lot of rain, for example, those slowly start to tilt in the soft soil, and after a period of time they may fall flat over. And then commonly they'll break also. They might be hit by a mower or something, and then the people move them and lean them up against a tree, I guess so they don't have to encounter them with a lawnmower, or maybe out of fear that they'll eventually sink into the ground, which does happen also, and completely be covered by the sod. The problem with that approach is that then you've removed the stone from the burial site. And people who come along later and are interested in the history expressed in the cemetery don't know precisely where that grave was located. So we've had that take place a number of times in the cemetery, and that's why you see stones that are leaning up against trees or in piles sometimes. So actually there are people in the community now that are taking an interest in looking at the records of the cemetery. Gary Rhodes from Oakwood Cemetery, for example, Walter Burnett from the city government, and they're taking a look at seeing what they can do to determine where certain stones that have been obviously moved belong, if they can. And of course, in some cases, putting some stones back together again that are in 2 or 3 pieces.
Yeah, it seems like not only standing up against these 2 trees that we're standing in between, but also all over the cemetery, piles of headstones that you can't really decipher anymore. What about those? Is there anything that can be done for those?
Fortunately, we have a good set of records for this cemetery. Marge Harris, for example, here in town, years ago did a survey of information about the burials here, both working with newspaper records and also with the stones themselves, and so that we have good records from what stones were available decades ago about who's buried here and what was on the stones. So that's very helpful also to determine, to put things back together and determine at least rough location in some ways for these moved stones. So we have good records.
Okay. Well, I just have to ask, what's next on the trip?
We're going to go look at a stone for a youngster, and also talk about the most noted figure, in a sense, associated with the cemetery, or the figure who's most unique, who was a stone carver.
So we've arrived at the next stop on our tour of the old Macomb Cemetery, and I find this particular headstone interesting, John, because it has obviously been broken into a couple of pieces, but it still looks fairly well maintained. I mean, you can still read the inscriptions and you can still see who lies here. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes, of course, this is an example of the kind of stone that you and I were just talking about, which often gets carted away from the burial site itself. But fortunately, this is still here. And it's a very good example of an early style of headstone. This is slate, which was very common before they had granite, for example, later in the 19th century. And it's also interesting in terms of the shape. This is a headboard or bedboard shape in that it looks like the head of a bed. Very common in the East Coast, in New England, and also beyond that in Europe. A shape that was later abandoned for a more rectangular or curved top style. It's also interesting because of the carving on it, and we actually have the signature, as it were, of the carver as well. But it begins with a formula that's fairly common in this cemetery: sacred to the memory of. And that particular formula is one indication of the stones of a man named John Long, who was our earliest identifiable stone carver here in McDonough County and maybe in all of western Illinois. Another thing, if you look at his terminology here and his approach: sacred to the memory of Nathan Mont Guh, and he just runs out of space after the G and picks it up with the next line, O-M-E-R-Y. In other words, he divided words, including names, whenever he ran out of space. He didn't try to center lines at all. Memory departed this life April 19th, A.D. 1834, age 65 years and so many months, and 19, yes, and even on years, Y-E-A-R, and he puts the S on the next line. And so he just cuts words anywhere that he runs out of space. And that's one of the identifiable features of a John Long stone. And here, down in the corner below that, you see his initials, J.L. John came west into the Macomb area about 1834, married a local gal, and lived about a mile from here, just north of the Lemoyne River. And he did a number of the early stones, that is, he carved them here in the old Macomb Cemetery in the 1830s and early 1840s. And in fact, his work as a pioneer stone carver are one of the things that makes this cemetery a unique historical site in the western Illinois region, because usually you cannot identify the early stone carvers at all. And he did a very good job with his lettering and with the general layout and nature and cut of the stones and use of borders and so forth. He was a very good stone carver.
It's very specific about the ages that people died. This one is 65 years, 5 months, and 19 days. Do you have any idea why that was part of his style?
That was a very common style, even sacred to the memory of, which he uses to begin his stones universally. That was a formula that he was copying from a tradition, and also putting down the not only the year of age, but also the number of months and days was also part of an early, ultimately European-based stone carving tradition.
Where are we going next, John?
We're heading nearby to the stone of a child.